Imagine a time before TikTok, before movies, when the streets were the stage and performers risked everything for a coin. Who were these forgotten artists of Victorian England, juggling fire or singing ballads for pennies? Prepare to uncover the hidden lives, the hardships, and the unexpected artistry of the street entertainers who truly defined live performance. Asterisk, when you walk through the crowded, soot-stained streets of Victorian London in the middle of the 19th century, your ears would often be met not just with the clatter of horse hooves or the hawking of vendors, but with a sound far stranger and more mechanical, the steady churn of a barrel organ. These street instruments, heavy and cumbersome wooden boxes on stands or wheeled carts, emitted tunes that ranged from jaunty dance melodies to solemn hymns. The organ grinder, often a poor immigrant, would turn the handle for hours on end, coaxing melodies from its bellows and pipes. Beside him, a small monkey dressed in a ragged waistcoat or a miniature soldier's outfit might dance, salute passers-by, or hold out a tin cup for pennies. To the modern imagination, the image of an organ grinder and his monkey seems whimsical, almost picturesque, like something from an old children's book illustration. But in Victorian England, this was not charming background. Color it was livelihood, desperation, and the daily grind of survival played out in public. The organ grinder was often despised, sometimes pitied, and rarely admired. Yet his music, repeated endlessly on narrow alleys and open squares, created one of the defining soundscapes of 19th century urban life. The organ itself was a marvel of mass-produced entertainment. Imported largely from Italy and later Germany, these machines could be operated by someone with no musical training whatsoever. Turning the handle activated a barrel studded with pins that opened valves, pushing air through pipes to play tunes. For a small investment, an otherwise unskilled laborer could transform himself into a street performer, capable of providing music that rivaled trained musicians in sheer volume, if not in artistry. But the organ grinder was more than just his machine. He was part of a larger social story, the migration of people, the anxieties of the urban classes, and the thin line between survival and destitution. Many of the grinders were Italian immigrants, especially from poor rural regions like Lucca. In Tuscany, families often sent their sons, sometimes no older than 10 or 12, to London or other industrial cities to earn money through grinding. These boys, speaking little or no English, would push their organs through unfamiliar neighborhoods, learning quickly which corners were profitable and which streets were hostile. And hostile they often were. To middle-class Victorians, the organ grinder was a nuisance. Charles Babbage, the mathematician and inventor, famously waged a crusade against them, writing furious letters about how their ceaseless noise disrupted his concentration while working on the designs for his calculating engines. He claimed they played the same handful of tunes over and over, hammering them into the ears of unwilling listeners. In truth, most organs were capable of holding only a few short melodies, and so repetition was unavoidable. A single neighborhood might hear Rule Britannia, or God Save the Queen dozens of times in an afternoon, but to the poor especially, children, the organ grinder was sometimes a source of delight. The monkey, dressed in a tattered little suit, was the true performer in many eyes. It could do tricks, mimic soldiers, collect coins in a cap, or bow politely. Children would run after the monkey, sometimes daring to touch it, sometimes frightened by its quick, darting movements. The monkey was both entertainment and a tool of trade, helping to loosen the coins from otherwise tight-fisted passers-by. Yet, the life of the monkey was far from charming. It was often kept on a chain, poorly fed and overworked. Accounts describe exhausted animals collapsing or becoming ill from exposure to the damp. English climate, the organ grinder's day was long. Morning meant finding a good spot, often near markets, theatres, or busy thoroughfares. Success depended on foot traffic, but also on avoiding the ire of local shopkeepers, who complained that the grinding drove away customers. Some neighbourhoods banned grinders altogether, leading to constant conflict with police. If caught without a license, an organ grinder might have his instrument confiscated or be fined, which for many meant the loss of their entire livelihood. For every coin dropped in the monkey's tin, there were also jeers and insults. Newspapers often painted organ grinders as pests, intruders, or even a kind of urban plague. Caricatures portrayed them as dirty, idle foreigners unwilling to perform. Real labour, yet what counted as real work in a city where unskilled jobs were vanishing fast? For many grinders, turning the handle was the only available option short of starvation. Still, the grinder's music seeped into daily life. People might complain, but they remembered the melodies. Housewives, annoyed at the noise, later caught themselves humming the tunes while doing laundry. Children imitated the organ's squeaky, uneven sounds in their games. Even composers were influenced. Often Bach and other musicians of the age occasionally referenced the barrel organ style in their works. The sound of grinding became as much a part of Victorian London as the tolling of church bells or the cries of street hawkers. And so the organ grinder occupied an uneasy space in society, visible yet ignored, entertaining yet unwanted, a bringer of music yet condemned for its monotony. He embodied the contradictions of the Victorian city, its hunger for spectacle and its disdain for the poor who provided it. But what of the grinders themselves? Who were the men behind the handles? The boys who trudged from street to street? The families who relied on these few coins collected from strangers' pockets? Their lives were often as mechanical and repetitive as the tunes they played, yet hidden behind them were human stories of migration, survival, and resilience. If you stop and imagine, for a moment, standing on a damp London street in the 1850s, hearing that organ wheeze out its repetitive song, you might ask, what did the grinder himself hear? Did he listen to the music as others did, or did it dissolve into nothing more than the sound of turning wood and shifting gears? Did he dream of something beyond the cobblestones, or was his world as small and confined as the few notes pinned into the barrel? That question remains. What was life really like for the man who stood behind the machine, endlessly turning the handle? If you follow the story of the organ grinder back beyond the damp alleys of London and the echoing courts of industrial Manchester, you will find yourself in the hills of Tuscany, in villages where stony fields and sparse crops gave little hope to the families who lived there. In places like Lucca and Parma, poverty drove parents to send their sons abroad. The boys, often scarcely more than children, were given into the care of padrone men who organized bands of grinders and sent them to foreign cities. The padrone provided the organ, sometimes the monkey, and took a large share of the earnings in return. To the families back home, the arrangement meant survival. The money sent back however meagre, could pay rent, buy seed, or feed siblings who might otherwise have gone hungry. The journey to England was long, and for the young grinders, bewildering. They arrived in cities where they did not know the language, dressed poorly, with no real understanding of the laws they were expected to obey. Their organs were heavy, awkward contraptions that had to be pushed on carts or strapped to their backs. Some of the grinders travelled in small groups, keeping together for safety in a foreign land, while others wandered alone. The organ became their passport, their shield, and their only means of earning. Each tune that wheezed from the pipes was not just a melody for passers-by, but a lifeline stretching across the sea to a family waiting in Italy. London, however, was not welcoming. The city in the mid-19th century was alive with anxieties about immigration, about noise, about the morality of the poor. Organ grinders, being both foreign and noisy, became easy targets. Newspapers railed against the Italian nuisance. Letters to the Times described grinders as invading pests who disrupted respectable households. Charles Dickens, though usually sympathetic to the poor, complained bitterly in his essays about the organ's persistence beneath his windows. Babbage, more famously, counted the number of times his work was interrupted by grinders and campaigned for laws to silence them, and laws did come. By the 1860s, the Metropolitan Police were granted authority to move grinders along. Some boroughs required licenses, others banned them outright. Yet regulation was inconsistent, and the grinder's life became a game of chance turn, the handle too long in the wrong square, and a constable's hand might fall on your shoulder. Licenses were expensive, often beyond the reach of a penniless migrant. This meant that most grinders operated illegally, perpetually at risk of fines or confiscation. For a man whose entire livelihood rested in the wood and pipes of his organ, losing it meant ruin. The grinder's hardships were not only legal but physical. The English climate was wet, cold, and harsh for those accustomed to Mediterranean sun. Thin clothing, poor diet, and constant exposure wore down their health. Many slept in cheap lodging houses in the slums of Clerkenwell, an area sometimes called Little Italy. The air there was thick with smoke and sewage. Overcrowding meant disease spread quickly. For immigrant grinders, life outside work was as bleak as the streets they played on. The monkey, often thought of as the grinder's companion, faced its own hardships. Small capuchins were imported through trade routes and sold as novelties, dressed in costumes to amuse the public. But few grinders could afford proper food or care for them. The animals developed illnesses, lost fur in the damp, or grew aggressive from mistreatment. When a monkey died, the grinder not only lost a partner, but also his most profitable attraction. Some grinders resorted to begging without the animal, but the monkey's absence often meant a sharp decline in earnings. Despite this, the figure of the grinder was not universally despised. Among the working poor, he was seen as one of their own, a man struggling to scrape a living by entertaining rather than stealing. Children delighted in the sound of the organs and the antics of the monkeys. Neighbors sometimes defended grinders. From the police, seeing in their persecution echoes of their own precarious existence, the grinders themselves formed quiet networks of solidarity, sharing tips about which streets were safest, which policemen were most lenient, and which days of the week brought the most generous crowds. Still, the hostility of the middle and upper classes could be unrelenting. Pamphlets complained that grinders spread crime and disease. Respectable households insisted that the ceaseless repetition of tunes was more than an annoyance, that it degraded culture, stunted musical appreciation, and disturbed the moral fiber of society. In reality, these were anxieties about class and immigration disguised as concerns about noise. The organ grinder, with his foreign accent, ragged clothes, and clumsy machine, represented everything that made the Victorian middle class uneasy, the visible poverty that threatened to creep too close to their own well-ordered lives. At the same time, reformers tried to intervene. Missionary societies in Clerkenwell attempted to teach the Italian boys English and basic literacy. Some offered religious instruction, hoping to guide them away from what was perceived as a life of idleness. Yet few of these efforts succeeded in changing the grinder's reality. The boys needed money, not sermons. They needed protection from hunger, not moral lectures. Their lives remained tethered to the slow turning of the handle and the few pennies it brought in. By the late 19th century, debates about street music became part of broader questions about urban order. Should the streets belong to the poor, who used them as workplaces, or to the respectable, who demanded quiet and cleanliness? Organ grinders were swept up in this larger struggle. To silence them was to assert control over the sounds of the city, to enforce a hierarchy of who was allowed to be heard. Yet, ironically, many of the same people who condemned grinders also relied on their presence. Street music softened the monotony of urban life. It marked weddings, funerals, and holidays. It drifted into factories and workshops, giving laborers something to hum along with. Even as the middle classes complained, they sometimes hired grinders for private events, appreciating in controlled settings the same music they rejected on public streets. And through it all, the grinders kept turning the handle. Day after day, year after year, they walked the same routes, played the same tunes, collected the same small coins. Their lives were repetitive, precarious, and rarely celebrated. Yet, without them, the Victorian city would have sounded different, emptier somehow, less textured. What is striking, when we look back, is how completely these men and their monkeys have been forgotten. Their names rarely appear in records. Their music left no scores, no recordings. Only faint traces remain. The complaints of the middle class, the sketches of satirical artists, and the memories of children who once clapped along to the wheezing tunes. The grinders themselves disappeared into the anonymity of the poor, absorbed into the vast history of migration and survival. Still, one must wonder, when the handle turned for the last time, and the organ fell silent, what happened to those men and their animals? Did they fade back to Italy, returning home with their meagre savings? Or did they remain in England, swallowed by the labouring poor, their identities dissolving as completely as their music dissolved into the air? That lingering uncertainty about where the grinders went and what became of them remains an unanswered chord in the long, monotonous melody of their history. The story of the organ grinder in Victorian England is not only about their presence, but also about their disappearance. For every street corner that once echoed with the wheeze of pipes and the squeak of a monkey's chain, there eventually came silence. The decline of the organ grinder was neither sudden nor dramatic. It was gradual, stretched over decades, as new technologies, shifting tastes, and stricter regulations slowly made their trade obsolete. By the closing decades of the 19th century, The Victorian city was transforming at a pace that even its residents could scarcely comprehend. Gaslight gave way to electricity, narrow lanes were widened into boulevards, and horse-drawn traffic made uneasy space for the first motor vehicles. Entertainment, too, evolved. What had once been spontaneous and found on the street began to migrate indoors into purpose-built spaces where sound and spectacle could be contained, ticketed and controlled. Music halls, in particular, emerged as the great rivals of the street performer, where the organ grinder offered a handful of short, repetitive tunes. The music hall promised variety, novelty, and polish. For the price of admission, an audience could hear singers, comedians, acrobats, and instrumentalists, all framed by gaslight and velvet curtains. Unlike the grinder's music, which could not be escaped once it began outside one's window, music hall entertainment was voluntary. One entered by choice. Respectable society preferred it that way. At the same time, the phonograph and the gramophone began their slow but inevitable conquest of sound. These machines, invented in the late 19th century, made it possible to listen to music at home, free from the disruptions of the street. Though recordings were primitive at first, their very existence undermined the need for itinerant musicians. Why endure the endless repetition of a barrel organ when you could place a needle on a disc and hear something new, something preserved by a famous singer or orchestra? The grinder, with his worn handle and his few tunes, was no match for the marvel of recorded sound. Municipal authorities also played their part in hastening the grinder's decline. Throughout the late Victorian period, city councils tightened licensing requirements. Street music was increasingly portrayed as a threat to public order, a disturbance to businesses, and a nuisance to the middle-class household. By the 1890s, the police were more assertive in confiscating instruments and dispersing grinders. The legal obstacles became insurmountable for many who already lived on the edge of poverty. A single fine could wipe out weeks of earnings. The grinder's symbolic association with foreignness, too, contributed to his vanishing. Anti-immigrant sentiment ran high during periods of economic distress, and Italian grinders were among the most visible faces of that immigrant presence. The caricature of the ragged foreigner with his clumsy machine, begging for pennies, fed into larger anxieties about the changing face of the city. As urban reform movements gained strength, they called not only for cleaner streets and safer housing, but also for quieter, more orderly neighborhoods, places where the unpredictable sound of a barrel organ had no place. For the monkeys, the end was even more decisive. Growing concern about animal cruelty, especially in the late Victorian reform movements, turned public opinion against the use of performing animals. Monkeys, dressed in tattered uniforms, shivering in the English cold, came to be seen less as novelties and more as victims. Campaigns for animal welfare pressured authorities to crack down on their use in public performance. Without the monkey to charm children and draw coins, the grinder's appeal diminished further. And yet, even as they faded, organ grinders left behind traces subtle, almost ghostly echoes in the culture of the city. Children's rhymes and playground games carried snatches of their tunes. Writers and artists, nostalgic or satirical, continued to reference them. In Punch magazine, cartoons of organ grinders persisted well after their numbers dwindled, a reminder of how deeply they had once been woven into urban life. Musically, too, their influence lingered. Composers occasionally imitated the sound of the barrel organ in their works. The repetitive, mechanical quality of grinding found its way into orchestral pieces as a kind of symbol for monotony or for the working-class street. In literature, the grinder's presence became a shorthand for poverty and persistence. Even when he was despised, he was recognized as an indelible part of the city's story. The very complaints of men like Babbage and Dickens, preserved in print, have ensured that the grinder is remembered. Ironically, it is the irritation of the middle classes that carved the grinder's place in history. Without their furious letters and essays, these men and their organs might have vanished entirely, leaving no record at all. Instead, we know them through the hostility they provoked. By the early 20th century, the organ grinder was almost gone from London streets. A few persisted in provincial towns or in immigrant neighborhoods, but they were increasingly rare. The soundscape of the modern city had changed. Where once you might have turned a corner and heard the squeal of pipes, now you heard the clatter of tramways or the hum of electric light. The grinder, once omnipresent, became an object of nostalgia, something old men remembered, something children no longer recognized, and yet there is a melancholy in their disappearance. For all their repetitiveness, their noise, and their nuisance, organ grinders represented a kind of human presence that the modern city has lost. They were poor, yes, and desperate, but they brought sound, spectacle, and life to streets otherwise filled only with commerce and grime. They were, in their way, part of the fabric of community, even if that community did not always welcome them. Today, if you search for traces of them, you may find only a few battered organs in museums, their pipes dusty, their barrels stiff with age. You may find a faded cartoon in a Victorian magazine, mocking the foreigner with his cap in hand. Or you may hear a faint memory in a song, a repetition that hints at the mechanical grind of a forgotten machine. What remains is not so much the music itself. It has been washed away by time, but the reminder that whole lives were once lived in service of those sounds. Boys from Italian villages, men on London corners, monkeys dancing in threadbare uniforms, turned endlessly with the handle, seeking pennies from strangers. Their music was boring, their work repetitive, their presence unwelcome, but without them, the Victorian street would have been quieter, and perhaps lonelier, and so the grinder disappears into history, leaving us to ask, when the city grows quiet, who decides which sounds are worth remembering, and which are allowed to fade into silence? If you were to follow the sounds of Victorian London's bustling streets, past the cries of fishmongers, the rattle of carriage wheels, and the steady beat of the lamplighter's boots, you might stumble upon something altogether more chaotic. The high-pitched squawk of Mr. Punch. It was a voice unlike any other nasal, shrill and distorted through a peculiar device known as a swazzle. Carried above the din of the street, it announced that a performance was about to begin, and soon children and adults alike would crowd around a small striped booth where wooden puppets struck each other with sticks, screamed in falsetto, and played out stories of domestic quarrels, policemen beaten senseless, and the devil himself dragged on stage. This was the world of the Punch and Judy Man, part entertainer, part craftsman, part itinerant labourer. He was as familiar a sight in England as the organ grinder or the street singer. With his collapsible stage, his trunk of puppets, and his uncanny ability to command a crowd, he traveled from town to town, square to square, bringing a form of comedy that was both ancient and startlingly modern in its chaotic energy. The story of Punch and Judy did not begin in England. Its roots stretch back to Italy's commedia dell'arte of the 16th and 17th centuries. The character of Punchinello, shortened in England to Punch, was a grotesque figure with a hooked nose, a hunchback, and a violent streak. When Italian puppet players travelled north, they brought him with them. By the 18th century, Punch had settled firmly into English life. Paired with his unfortunate wife Judy, and supported by a cast of stock characters, the baby, the policeman, the crocodile, and occasionally even death itself. By the time Queen Victoria came to the throne, Punch shows were already a staple of British street entertainment. The booth itself was simple, but instantly recognizable. Draped in striped cloth, often red and white, it stood tall enough to hide the puppeteer and his assistant. Inside, the performer crouched, one hand operating Punch, the other manipulating Judy or whichever character was needed. The voices emerged through the swazzle, a small reed instrument held in the mouth that produced the distinctive squeak associated with Punch. The swazzle was a badge of the trade. It took practice to master, and without it, a performer could not claim true legitimacy as a punchman to the watching crowd. However, none of this mattered. What mattered was the spectacle. Children squealed with delight as Punch walloped Judy with his stick, or as the crocodile tried to swallow the baby. Adults, too, found something compelling in the grotesque violence and absurd humor. The jokes were broad, often crude, and endlessly repetitive. But they tapped into something primal, the pleasure of watching authority mocked and order overturned. The policeman, a symbol of Victorian discipline, was regularly beaten senseless by Punch to the cheers of the crowd. Even the hangman, when he appeared, was outwitted. In the world of Punch, the trickster always triumphed. No matter how cruel or foolish his antics, the life of the Punch and Judy Man, however, was not one of triumph. It was grueling, precarious, and dependent entirely on the willingness of passers-by to throw a penny or two into the collecting hat. Performers carried their stages on their backs or loaded them onto carts. Setting up meant staking out a corner where a crowd could gather, but where shopkeepers and police would not interfere. A good day might bring enough for food and lodging. A bad day could mean going hungry. Unlike the music hall professionals, who had steady engagements and contracts, the Punchman lived from hand to mouth, reliant on weather, crowds, and chance. The shows themselves were shaped by this precariousness. They had to be quick, loud, and compelling. A Punchman could not afford to lose an audience once gathered. The humor was repetitive by design, the violence exaggerated, the voices piercing enough to cut through the roar of the city. The collecting hat was often passed around mid-show, a reminder that laughter alone did not pay for bread. Some performers worked alone, while others brought assistants to drum up the crowd or play music. Children were the most faithful audience, but they had no money. The Punchman relied on adults to give coins, whether out of amusement, pity, or the simple desire to keep their children entertained for a few moments. Performers learned how to appeal to both at once, jokes broad enough for children, sly enough for adults. Punch might crack a line about marriage that only grown-ups understood. then immediately be chased across the stage by the crocodile to keep the little ones laughing, for all its chaos. The Punch show was strangely conservative in its structure. The story, if it could be called that, never varied much. Punch mistreated Judy. The baby was dropped or beaten. The policeman arrived and was thrashed. The hangman was tricked, and sometimes even the devil himself was driven off. It was a cycle of violence and reversal, endlessly repeated. Yet repetition was the heart of its appeal. Audiences knew what to expect and came precisely because of it. The Victorians, however, were divided on the matter. Some saw Punch as a harmless diversion, a bit of rough comedy for the streets. Others condemned it as corrupting, especially for children. The spectacle of a husband beating his wife or of authority mocked in public seemed to many reformers a dangerous influence. Writers debated whether Punch taught cruelty or whether it merely reflected it. But the shows continued, regardless of moral anxiety, because they were cheap, portable, and beloved by the people who filled the streets. The Punchman himself was a figure of contradictions. He was both admired for his skill and dismissed as a nuisance. He was an artist, of sorts, yet rarely recognized as one. His labor was invisible, crouching in the cramped booth, juggling puppets, voices, and timing while only the puppets received attention. Many Punchmen remained anonymous, their names forgotten even by those who had watched their shows. Few, however, gained reputations, traveling widely and earning modest fame within the circuit of street entertainers. Punch and Judy were more than just entertainment. They were part of the soundscape and rhythm of Victorian life. On holidays, fairs, and seaside outings, they were essential. By the 1850s and 1860s, they had spread beyond the streets into resorts like Brighton and Blackpool, where Punch shows became as much a fixture as sand and salt water. Families expected to see them at the seaside, and for many children it was there on the beach, under striped awnings, that they first encountered the squawking voice of Punch. Yet on the city streets, the presence of Punch was still contentious. Like organ grinders, Punchmen sometimes found themselves moved along by police or accused of obstructing traffic. Shopkeepers complained that the noise drove customers away. Clergymen worried about the moral effect, and reformers, increasingly vocal about the protection of children, argued that scenes of violence were unsuitable for young minds. But the Punch and Judy Man endured. His booth, with its striped cloth and squawking voice, was cheap, adaptable, and endlessly repeatable. It required no ticket office, no posters, no advertisements. All it needed was a busy street and a few curious children to start drawing a crowd. In that sense, Punch was perfectly suited to Victorian life, a form of entertainment that matched the energy and disorder of the streets themselves. Still, one wonders, how did the Punchmen themselves view their craft? Was it merely a means of scraping by, or did they see themselves as part of a tradition stretching back centuries? Did they feel pride in the laughter they provoked, or was it drowned out by the exhaustion of crouching in a cramped booth all day for a handful of pennies? These questions linger, because like the organ grinders, the Punchmen left few records. Their legacy survives not in diaries or memoirs, but in the squeaking voices that once cut through the city air, in the sketches of satirical magazines, and in the dim memory of generations who once gathered around the booth to laugh at the antics of a wooden man with a hooked nose and a stick, And so we pause at the striped curtain, listening to the squawk of Punch, and ask, was this raucous? Comedy merely street noise, or was it something more, a mirror of Victorian society itself, reflecting its anxieties, its pleasures, and its contradictions? Behind the striped curtain of the Punch and Judy booth, unseen by the crowd, lay a world of careful craftsmanship, physical endurance, and a set of tricks passed down from performer to performer. To the audience, it all seemed simple, wooden, figures bobbing on sticks, shrill voices, and crude jokes. Yet to bring Punch to life required a peculiar set of skills that few possessed and even fewer mastered completely. The most distinctive tool of the Punch Man was that tiny reed contraption which transformed the puppeteer's voice into the unmistakable squeak of Mr. Punch. It was a curious device, little more than two small pieces of metal or bone, sandwiching a reed of thin silver or cane bound together. With thread, the performer placed it in the back of his mouth, balancing it between tongue and palate, and with practice could speak or even sing through it. The swazzle was not merely a gimmick, it was the very essence of Punch. Without it, the voice was wrong, and without the voice, Punch lost his bite. But the swazzle was not easy to use. Beginners often choked or swallowed them, leading to panicked interruptions of shows. Seasoned Punch men carried several spares tucked into their waistcoats in case of accidents. Learning to speak clearly while holding the swazzle required long practice, as did the trick of slipping it discreetly in and out of the mouth so that other characters, Judy, the policeman, the hangman, could speak in a natural voice. The best performers could switch instantly, making Punch squeal 1 second and Judy scold the next, creating the illusion of dialogue between two living beings. Rather than a man crouched in a cramped booth, the puppets themselves were works of craft. Carved from wood, often by the performers themselves, they were painted in bold colors to catch the eye even from a distance. Punch, with his hooked nose, humpback, and bright red costume, was instantly recognizable. Judy, in her bonnet and apron, was his foil. Other figures, baby, policeman, hangman, crocodile, were carved as needed, sometimes crudely, sometimes with surprising artistry. A good puppet could last for years, patched and repainted as it wore down from endless performances. Some Punch men inherited puppets from older performers, carrying not just wood and paint, but the memory of countless shows already given. The booth was no less important. Portable and collapsible, it had to be sturdy enough to withstand rough handling and sudden gusts of wind, yet light enough for a man to carry on his back. Striped cloth gave it a cheerful appearance, a visual signal as distinctive as the sound of Punch's voice. Inside, however, conditions were cramped and uncomfortable. The performer crouched or knelt for long stretches, arms raised above his head to manipulate the puppets, often until his shoulders ached. Sweat, heat, and fatigue were constant companions. And yet, once the curtain lifted, all discomfort was hidden, transformed into the clattering chaos of sticks and squeals. For many Punch men, the craft was They travelled with their booths from city to city, seaside resort to seaside resort, following the rhythms of fairs and holidays. In summer, they might set up at Brighton or Margate, where crowds of working-class families on excursion crowded the sands. In winter, they returned to London, haunting Covent Garden, Whitechapel, and Clerkenwell. Travel was difficult, money uncertain, but mobility was part of survival. Staying too long in one place meant exhausting the generosity of local audiences and attracting the ire of shopkeepers. Movement kept the act fresh, the pennies flowing, and the authorities at bay. The itinerant life shaped the punchman into a kind of fraternity. Though competitors, in one sense, they often shared advice, tips, or even lodging. A newcomer might learn how to make a swazzle from an older performer, or where to find cheap wood for puppets. On occasion, rival booths set up close by, leading. Two dueling punches, each trying to shout down the other, their swazzled voices squealing across the square until the crowds thinned from confusion. Yet more often than not, performers respected each other's turf, knowing too well how thin the margins of survival were. But the punch show, as it grew in visibility, attracted not only audiences, but also critics. Moralists denounced it as violent, vulgar, and corrupting. The image of Punch thrashing Judy with his stick struck many reformers as a grotesque endorsement of domestic violence. Some saw the constant ridicule of authority figures, the policeman, the hangman, as dangerous in an age when discipline and order were valued above all. Others argued that the crudeness of the humor, the bawdy innuendos slipped between squeaks, exposed children to impropriety. Debates about Punch became part of a larger Victorian anxiety about entertainment itself. Could the poor be trusted with laughter that mocked authority? Was violence on stage, however ridiculous, an incitement to real violence off stage? The same anxieties that targeted penny dreadfuls, street songs, and music halls found their way to the puppet booth. Clergymen preached against Punch, newspapers called for restrictions, and some local authorities attempted to ban performances altogether. Yet Punch endured, defended not only by the affection of the working classes, but also by some surprising allies. Certain writers, though critical of the violence, admired the tradition's longevity. Charles Dickens, for all his concern about the moral effect, confessed a certain fondness for the grotesque figure of Punch. Other observers argued that the show's very absurdity robbed it of danger no child. They claimed, mistook the antics of a wooden puppet for serious moral instruction, and indeed, audiences seemed to treat Punch as both shocking and harmless, an outlet for laughter in a society that demanded restraint in most other settings. The violence was too exaggerated, too farcical, to be taken as a model for real behavior. The policeman's endless beatings were not a revolutionary act, but a comic reversal, a fantasy of resistance that could exist only on the street corner. In this sense, Punch embodied a paradox, simultaneously criticized as dangerous and tolerated as trivial. For the punchmen themselves, these debates mattered little in practice. What mattered was whether the hat filled with coins. They honed their craft not to win the approval of reformers, but to hold the attention of crowds. If a joke brought laughter, it stayed. If a puppet bored audiences, it was discarded. The craft evolved through trial and error, refined by countless shows, passed down by memory rather than written script. There was no definitive Punch show, only patterns repeated until they became tradition. Still, there was pride in the craft. A skilled punchman was admired by his peers, not only for his mastery of the swazzle or his deft puppet manipulation, but for his ability to work the crowd to draw laughter, to provoke gasps, to keep pennies flowing. It was a precarious pride, built on a fragile livelihood, but it was real. In the shadows of the booth, Bent double with aching arms, a punchman could still feel that he had commanded an audience, however briefly, with nothing more than wood, cloth, and voice. And yet one cannot help but wonder, did those who crouched behind the curtain believe themselves to be mere entertainers, or did they sense, even dimly, that they were carrying forward a centuries-old tradition, shaping the culture of the streets as surely as any organ grinder or ballad singer? Did they recognize the debates swirling around them? Or did the squeak of the swazzle drown out the moral anxieties of the wider world? These questions linger, unresolved, like the faint echo of Punch's voice across a Victorian square, squeal at once ridiculous and strangely enduring. By the mid-19th century, the figure of Punch had already weathered centuries of performance. He had crossed from Italy to England, shifted from marionette to glove puppet, and turned from courtly amusement to street corner chaos. Yet no tradition, however resilient, could remain untouched by the social and technological transformations of Victorian Britain. The streets that once rang with his shrill voice were being reshaped, regulated, and in many ways silenced. Punch, though still grinning, was slowly pushed aside or, rather, relocated into new spaces where he would acquire a different character altogether. One of the great turning points was the rise of the seaside holiday. The expansion of the railways in the 1840s and 1850s opened coastal resorts to the working and middle classes alike. Towns such as Brighton, Margate, and Blackpool swelled each summer with families seeking sea, air, and diversion. For the punchmen, these resorts became a new stage. Instead of precarious performances on crowded London pavements, they now had long stretches of beach where families gathered, relaxed, and willingly parted with pennies for entertainment. The seaside punch show retained much of its rough humour. Punch still beat Judy, fought the policeman, and triumphed over the hangman, but the context softened its effect. Against the backdrop of sandcastles and donkey rides, the violence seemed less threatening, more like slapstick comedy. Parents brought their children to watch, and Punch's squeal became one of the expected sounds of the holiday, alongside the crash of waves and the cries of hawkers. For many children of the later Victorian period, their first encounter with Punch was not in the alleys of London, but on a breezy seafront, their laughter mingling with gulls. At the same time, Punch was finding his way into middle-class drawing rooms. Performers were sometimes hired for private parties, particularly at Christmas. In this setting, Punch was subtly reshaped. The jokes were softened, the innuendos trimmed, the beatings presented more as farce than cruelty. The intimacy of the drawing room demanded a different kind of performance, less raucous, more controlled, and tailored to the sensibilities of polite society. Some performers even published scripts, offering a sanitized Punch suitable for children. This process of adaptation reflected broader Victorian tensions between high and low culture. Street Punch was part of the noisy, unruly life that reformers sought to discipline. Drawing room Punch was a tamed version, a safe echo of a tradition that polite families could enjoy without embarrassment. In this transition, Punch lost some of his anarchic edge, but gained a new lease of life as a fixture of childhood entertainment. Mechanical invention also played a role in Punch's decline as a street phenomenon. The late Victorian period saw the spread of new amusements. The music hall, with its professional comedians and singers, offered entertainment on a grander scale, while mechanical novelties such as coin-operated machines and, eventually, early cinema drew the public's attention. Against these, the humble puppet booth seemed old-fashioned. Where once the shrill voice of Punch had filled the open air, now gramophones and orchestrions promised louder, more varied sound. Crowds that might once have clustered around a puppet show now gathered in halls lit by gas lamps, dazzled by spectacle. Authorities, too, continued to regulate street performance. By the later 19th century, London's growing bureaucracy imposed licenses and restrictions that made it harder for itinerant punchmen to operate freely. Parks and promenades sometimes offered permits, but the age of unregulated, spontaneous performance was waning. The puppet booth that once sprang up on a street corner whenever a performer pleased was increasingly confined to designated spaces, seaside sands, park fairs, or paid engagements. Yet for all these changes, Punch endured. His figure, with hooked nose and squeaky voice, became a cultural icon recognizable even to those who had never seen a live performance. Illustrators depicted him in satirical cartoons. Toy makers produced miniature Punch dolls. His image appeared on advertisements and trade cards. What had once been a fleeting performance on a street corner was now a symbol that circulated through print and commerce. This symbolic Punch was often ambiguous. To some, he remained a figure of comic rebellion, forever mocking authority with his stick. To others, he became a faintly embarrassing relic of rougher times, a reminder of the vulgarity that polite society preferred to forget. By the early 20th century, Punch was already viewed with a certain nostalgia, part of a vanished world of street cries, ballad singers, and organ grinders. Children, however, ensured his survival, as the tradition moved further into nurseries and holiday resorts. Punch became increasingly associated with childhood memory. Generations recalled sitting on sandy beaches, transfixed as the crocodile snapped at Punch, or as the baby was unceremoniously dropped. The laughter of children softened the edges of the violence, transforming it into something harmlessly absurd. By the time Punch was firmly entrenched as a children's show, his reputation as a corrupter of morals had largely faded. Indeed, in this later form, Punch acquired a nostalgic aura. Adults who had grown up watching the shows looked back with fondness, not horror. What reformers once condemned as vulgar and brutal became, in memory, quaint and old-fashioned, part of the texture of a bygone age, like the cry of the muffin man or the rattle of the costermonger's cart. The squeal of Punch evoked not corruption but a lost world of childhood and community. Still, this nostalgia carried a paradox. To tame Punch into a symbol of innocence required forgetting the unruly figure he once was. The Punch of the street, mocking the law, beating his wife, laughing at death was not easily reconciled with the Punch of the nursery. Yet perhaps that very contradiction explains his endurance. He could be, depending on context, either a threat or a joke, a scandal or a comfort. His very grotesqueness gave him flexibility. By the dawn of the 20th century, Punch was no longer a central figure of popular culture, but he had not disappeared. He lingered on beaches, in parks, and in the memory of those who grew up with his antics. Later still, folklorists and collectors would record his history, preserving his scripts, swazzles, and puppets in museums. What had once been a living performance on the streets became a subject of heritage, a cultural artifact to be studied and remembered. And so the tradition declined not with a single moment of collapse, but with a slow migration from one setting to another, from one meaning to another. The Punch who once shouted defiantly on London pavements ended up grinning from behind museum glass, or squeaking harmlessly for holidaymakers on a beach. He was both diminished and preserved, both relic and survivor. Even now, when a Punch and Judy show appears, it carries with it a faint echo of that older world. The swazzled voice, the slap of the stick, the striped boothall remind us of a time when entertainment was rougher, cheaper, and more immediate, when laughter could be coaxed from a crowd with nothing more than wood, cloth, and squeak in. That echo lies the cultural trace of Punch, not a grand legacy, perhaps, but a stubborn one, still grinning, still absurd, still reminding us if only faintly of the noisy, chaotic world of the Victorian street. As dusk settled over the long avenues and narrow lanes of Victorian London, a transformation unfolded that was both ordinary and enchanted. The daylight thinned, the shadows stretched, and then, almost imperceptibly, a new kind of light crept into the city. It came not from the sun, but from rows of tall iron posts crowned with glass globes gas lamps, awaiting their nightly breath of flame. And into this dimming world stepped the figure who would bring them to life, the lamplighter, with ladder over his shoulder or long pole in his hand. He moved from street to street, striking sparks and coaxing fire into being. Each lamp he touched bloomed into a soft, steady glow, until the road was strung with small islands of light, like pearls on an endless thread. The lamplighter worked quickly and without fuss, yet to those who watched children at windows, passers-by hurrying home there, was something ritualistic about his task. He was both a labourer and, in a sense, a kind of priest of the evening, summoning brightness from darkness. In the early days of gaslight, beginning in the 1810s and spreading widely through the mid-century, the lamplighter's presence was inseparable from the experience of night in the city. Before gas, the streets were treacherous. Oil lamps had been few and faint, often left unlit or extinguished by wind. Night meant shadow, and shadow meant danger footpads lurking in alleys, accidents. On unlit roads, respectable women and men hurrying home before the darkness thickened. To many, gaslight felt like a miracle, steady, reliable, banishing fear from the streets. And the lamplighter, though rarely praised, was the man who made the miracle happen each night. There was something profoundly rhythmic about his work. Every evening he walked his appointed beat, lamp after lamp, mile after mile, and each morning, often before most of the city stirred, he returned to extinguish them one by one, leaving the sun to take their place. This daily cycle gave lamplighters a peculiar intimacy with time. They were keepers of dusk and dawn, marking the boundaries of night for everyone else. The work itself was hardly glamorous. Lamplighters were employed by gas companies or by parish vestries, given routes to cover, and paid modest wages. They carried ladders in the earlier decades, climbing up to each lamp to open the glass and light it with a small taper. Later, with improvements, they used long poles tipped with a flame, or hook, reaching up from the street. Their uniforms were simple sturdy boots, jackets resistant to soot, sometimes a cap that marked them as employees of the company. Yet despite the plainness of the job, the lamplighter entered folklore and song. Children often adored them. Their are countless recollections in memoirs of boys running behind the lamplighter as he moved down the street, racing the spark of light from lamp to lamp, cheering each little explosion of flame. For a child, it was as though magic were being performed, an ordinary man wielding the power to make stars appear on earth. Nurses and governesses sometimes used the lamplighter as a figure in lullabies, weaving him into the twilight ritual of putting children to bed. He was steady, dependable, safe. If the lamplighter had come, then the night was tamed. Poets, too, found him irresistible. In verses published in newspapers and cheap song sheets, the lamplighter was sometimes imagined as a solitary wanderer, bearing a light through a dark and uncertain world. He was compared to a guardian angel, to a lover calling on sweethearts beneath their windows, even to a philosopher of the streets who knew the city more intimately than any gentleman. The reality was more prosaic, of course, but the image endured. The lamplighter's song was not a literal one few actually sang as they worked, but a metaphor for the quiet music of his nightly rounds, the hum of flame-catching wick, the footsteps echoing down a half-empty road. Gaslight itself transformed more than just safety. It altered the culture of the night. With streets more navigable, evening life expanded. Theatres thrived, shops extended their hours, promenades glittered with rows of lamps. Couples could stroll later, families could venture out in confidence, and the great divide between day and night was softened. Yet none of this would have been possible without the patient, unremarkable labour of the lamplighter. His task was humble, but the city's new rhythms of pleasure and commerce rested upon it. And yet, for all this, lamplighters were not highly regarded. They were not heroes of progress, but invisible servants of it. The gas companies took the credit for illumination. Engineers boasted of their pipes and burners. Reformers praised the safety of the light. The man with the ladder, trudging his route, remained a shadowy figure. Many lived modestly, their families crowded in cheap lodgings. Their work demanded punctuality, and discipline lamps must be lit at the same time each evening, but offered little opportunity for advancement. If they were remembered fondly, it was less as individuals than as symbols, part of the nightly texture of the city dot. Still, there is something moving in that very anonymity. The lamplighter's life was a life of service without acclaim, of routine without spectacle, of quiet constancy in a world of change. He belonged to the hour when day gave way to night, and for that reason alone he lingered in memory, even after gaslight itself gave way to electricity. In the hushed moment of evening, when the last rays of sun bled from the rooftops and the first lamp glowed against the deepening sky, Londoners often paused to watch. They might not have spoken to the lamplighter, nor even known his name, but they saw the light he left behind. His presence was felt in absence, in the glow that turned the street from darkness into something walkable, inhabitable, even beautiful. The lamplighter may not have sung aloud, but the ballad beneath the gaslight was his, written nightly in sparks and flame, and sung silently in the hearts of those who walked the city after dark. If the lamplighter was romanticized in song and memory, the real man beneath the ladder and pole led a life far more tangled with hardship than poetry would suggest. His silhouette, strolling at twilight, may have looked serene from a distance, but up close he was a worker bound by the strict timetables of his employers, subject to rain and frost, soot and smoke. and the constant watchfulness of supervisors who measured his punctuality down to the minute. The great gas companies that controlled London's illumination divided the city into territories, each one punctuated by hundreds of lamps. A lamplighter was given a beat of perhaps 200 or 300 posts, strung across streets, alleys, and crescents, and it was his duty to see that each one was lit every night without fail. The work was repetitive, but it required precision. A lamp unlit was not just an inconvenience, it was an offence for which he could be fined or dismissed. A missed light meant a stretch of street left in dangerous darkness, and complaints from residents quickly found their way to company officers. His day was defined by 2 marches, one in the evening and one in the early morning. In winter, when nights were long, he began his rounds as early as 4 in the afternoon, and did not finish extinguishing until well into the following morning. In summer, his hours shifted, but the task was no lighter. He carried with him his tools. In the earlier decades, a ladder heavy enough to be balanced on cobblestones, its wooden frame scarred from constant use. Later, when lamps were fitted with small valves, he bore instead a long pole tipped with a flame or hook, and sometimes a cloth to wipe the glass of a soot-clogged lantern. The dangers were constant. In wet weather, ladders slipped, and falls were common. The glass of the lamps, hot from the flame, could crack or burst in sudden rain, spraying shards. The lamplighter's clothes grew stained with soot, and his hands calloused from cold metal. In poorer districts, boys sometimes pelted them with stones or mocked them as they worked, treating them as convenient targets for mischief. A lamplighter, on his round, might be soaked through, his boots filling with water from the gutters. Yet he pressed on, for the lamps had to burn regardless of weather. The wages he received rarely compensated for the strain. Most lamplighters were paid between 1 shilling and 2 shillings a night, a sum barely sufficient to maintain a household in London. Their contracts left little room for rest. There were no weekends free, for lamps were needed every night. If he fell ill, he was expected to find a substitute at his own cost, lest the lamps go dark. And because the gas companies prized order and uniformity, even the smallest infraction a lamp lit late, a flame allowed to burn to low could bring reprimand. Yet within this regimented life there grew a peculiar fraternity. Lamplighters often met one another at the edges of their beats, exchanging a few words in the dusk, sharing complaints about supervisors or tips about trimming wicks and polishing glass. Some formed little informal associations, helping one another when sickness struck, or banding together to petition for better pay. In memoirs, a few recalled the small joys of this fellowship: a flask of tea shared at the corner of a street, a laugh at the antics of neighborhood children racing the light down the road. Though most of their hours were solitary, these brief encounters stitched them into a brotherhood of men who belonged to the margins of day. Loneliness, however, was a constant companion. To be a lamplighter was to walk alone through the city, while others gathered indoors. The pubs filled with warmth, the theatres swelled with laughter, the parlours glowed with domestic comfort, but the lamplighter kept to his post, pacing steadily from street to street. Some spoke of knowing the city better than any policeman, of walking its veins until they could navigate blindfolded. They saw the back streets that clerks never entered, the alleys where beggars huddled, the silhouettes of women leaning at corners, the odd shadows of cats slipping between crates. They belonged to a hidden map of the metropolis, A geography drawn by Lamp, L-I-G-H-T, dot. For all their invisibility, lamplighters could not escape notice. Their presence was registered by householders who leaned from windows to call out a complaint or a friendly greeting. Some became familiar figures in their neighborhoods, known to children who followed their rounds or women who left a mug of tea by the door in winter. Others remained anonymous, shadows among shadows. The disparity reflected the city itself. In genteel districts, lamplighters might be greeted with courtesy, while in rougher quarters they were just one more laborer among the working poor. The gas companies, for their part, treated lamplighters less as men and more as extensions of the great machine of illumination. Managers kept ledgers, recording routes, times, and failures. Inspectors were dispatched to ensure lamps were trimmed evenly and flames burned at the correct height. If a lamplighter fell behind schedule, he might find himself written up in reports, reduced to an entry in a bureaucratic notebook. There was little romance in these pages, just measurements of efficiency, as though light could be made entirely mechanical and human effort erased. And yet, despite this bureaucratic weight, lamplighters clung to a certain pride in their work. They knew, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant for a street to glow warmly at night rather than vanish into blackness. They saw how people paused to admire the rows of lamps in fog, their halos diffusing into golden rings. They heard the sigh of relief in voices that said, "The lamplighter's been by." Their pride was small, but it was genuine, rooted in the knowledge that their labor made the city safer, kinder, more livable. There were, too, moments of small beauty. A lamplighter might pause on a bridge over the Thames, watching his lamps, mirrored in the water like a procession of trembling stars. He might find himself the sole figure on a fog-drenched street, each lamp glowing faintly in the mist, as though he had wandered into another world. Such experiences did not erase the grind of poverty or the lash of the rain, but they offered glimpses of poetry in the midst of toil. In the end, the lamplighter lived between two worlds, the mechanical world of gas companies and regulations, and the human world of footsteps, shadows, and faces glimpsed through glass. He was a servant of industry, but also a witness to the nightly life of the city, and though his name rarely appeared in records, his work left traces in the memory of every street he lit. The hardship was real, the pay meager, but the lamplighter endured, carrying his flame through wind and rain, one lamp at a time, until the city glowed like a constellation beneath the gaslit sky. By the late 19th century, the lamplighter's world was beginning to fade, just as steadily as each flame he trimmed intended at dawn. For more than half a century, he had been a familiar figure, so familiar that Londoners often scarcely noticed him. Yet by the 1880s and 1890s, new inventions were already drawing the curtain upon his nightly rounds. The agent of this decline was not gas itself, but electricity. In the grand avenues of the West End, engineers experimented with powerful arc lamps, their dazzling white beams flooding squares with a brightness no gas mantle could match. At first, electricity was temperamental, its machinery bulky, its costs extravagant, but as the century turned, improvements in wiring, bulbs, and generating stations rendered it ever more practical. Where a lamplighter once carried his ladder or pole, now a switch could be thrown from a central station, igniting a whole row of lamps in a moment. Efficiency that modern idol had spoken. The slow procession of the lamplighter could not compete with the instant brilliance of electric light. The transition was uneven. Gas companies, deeply invested in their networks, fought to retain control, introducing brighter incandescent mantles that gave a whiter, steadier flame. For a while, this held back the tide. Streets of middle-class terraces and working courts still glowed with gas, and lamplighters still walked their rounds. But the handwriting was on the wall, or rather, in the glow above it. Borough by borough, district by district, London's lamps were rewired for electricity. By the 1920s, the lamplighter had become a rare sight. By mid-century, he had all but vanished. For the lamplighters themselves, the change meant the erosion of a livelihood already meet. Some were kept on in diminished roles, maintaining the remaining gas lamps, cleaning globes, or checking electrical fittings. Others drifted into other forms of work, street sweepers, factory hands, or porters. Many were too old to retrain, and they slipped quietly into poverty, their labor eclipsed by machines. The fraternity of lamplighters, once bound by shared hardship and nightly camaraderie, thinned into memory. Yet even as the trade dwindled, the lamplighter's image began to soften into nostalgia. Poets and balladeers who had once sung of his solitary rounds with sentimental warmth now treated him as an emblem of a vanishing London. Children's rhymes kept his figure alive. Verses about lighting the lamps one by one whispered at nursery windows. In the music halls, comic songs recalled him as a quaint relic, more amusing than real. Painters captured him in watercolors, his ladder leaning against a post, his shadow stretching into twilight, as though he were a guardian spirit of the street. The irony was sharp. While lamplighters lived in poverty, their image became ever more romanticized. In respectable parlors, framed prints of a lamplighter at work hung as symbols of simpler times. Novelists included him in atmospheric scenes, a signifier of cozy urban evenings. Dickens had immortalized him earlier, but later writers echoed the theme, portraying him as a gentle servant of the city, his flame a metaphor for hope in darkness. The real man, with his calloused hands and soaked boots, was absent from these depictions. What remained was the shadow, the symbol. Electricity itself carried a different aura. Where gaslight was soft and golden, electricity was sharp and white, clinical in its clarity. The change in illumination was also a change in atmosphere. Streets once haloed in misty yellow now shone with an uncompromising brilliance. To older generations, this brightness felt almost cruel, stripping away the mystery and intimacy of the night. They recalled with longing the days when the lamplighter's touch marked the slow unfurling of evening, one flame at a time, instead of a sudden blaze flooding an entire boulevard. Nostalgia, in this sense, was not only for the man, but for the kind of night he created. In small corners of London, however, gaslight lingered. Certain mews, alleys, or historic districts clung to their lamps, and for these, a handful of lamplighters survived into the 20th century. Tourists marveled at them, photographing the curious sight of a man in cap and coat, pole in hand, bending to a task that seemed centuries old. By the 1950s, articles in newspapers treated them as curiosities, the last lamplighters of London. These few men, often elderly, carried a burden heavier than their poles. They bore the weight of representing an entire vanished trade. When they retired, The world noted their passing with fond but distant affection, as though closing a chapter in a beloved storybook. Beyond London, the lamplighter's ghost lingered in other towns and cities. Across Europe and in parts of America, gaslight had once reigned, and its keepers had paced their own streets. Everywhere, they followed the same trajectory: first indispensable, then outpaced, and finally remembered with wistful charm. The lamplighter became not just a London figure, but a universal symbol of 19th century urban life, appearing in postcards, souvenirs, even children's toys. What is most striking, perhaps, is how the lamplighter persisted in imagination. Long after his physical disappearance, the figure of the man with the pole and ladder appears again and again in popular culture, sometimes as a symbol of romance, sometimes of melancholy. He crops up in novels, in early cinema, even in the sentimental songs of the mid-20th century. Always, he is remembered as a bringer of light, a solitary but somehow reassuring presence in the dusk. And so the lamplighter, who in life had endured long nights, scant pay, and anonymity, found in death a kind of immortality. He became a character larger than himself, a figure of folklore, a reminder of how cities once awoke to their evenings, not with a switch, but with the steady tread of a man carrying flame. His work, forgotten by bureaucratic records and disregarded by employers, lived on in memory precisely because it belonged to the realm of ritual. The lamplighter's song was never truly his own. It was the city's song, sung back to him by poets and painters, remembered long after his lamp had gone dark by the mid-20th century, when electricity was universal and neon signs blazed. Over London's avenues, the lamplighter survived only in children's tales and in the wistful recollections of the elderly. Yet even then, when his presence was no longer required, the idea of him remained oddly comforting. In nursery rhymes and old stories, he went on walking, the quiet guardian of the night, the man who set the stars in order along the streets. The lamplighter's trade ended not with a bang, but with a dimming. One by one, the lamps he had tended were converted, the ladders set aside, the poles left to rust. But in imagination, he never entirely departed. He remained a shadow beneath the gaslight, a faint melody in the twilight of the Victorian city. His was a humble labour, and yet, in its passing, London lost not only a profession but a piece of its nightly soul. For what was extinguished with the lamplighter was not merely a flame, but a ritual of becoming night unordered procession of light blooming street by street, a rhythm that gave shape to the evening. With electricity, the city leapt into modernity. With the lamplighter's departure, it lost one of its oldest companions, and still, somewhere in the collective memory, he lingers, a solitary man with a pole, kindling stars along the streets of a gaslit city. If one walked through the thoroughfares of Victorian London with an attentive ear, amid the cacophony of carriage wheels, hawkers' cries, the hiss of steam engines, and the sing-song pitches of ballad sellers, another sound might intrude, rhythmic thumps upon the cobbles. They were uneven, hollow, a percussive counterpoint to the surrounding noise. And when one turned toward the source, there, in a circle of passers-by, might be seen a man or, sometimes a woman dancing on wooden legs. These figures were at once curiosities, performers, beggars, and survivors. They were men who had lost limbs to industrial accidents, women maimed by illness or deformity, soldiers returned from battle scarred and broken. Their wooden legs were not hidden away, as polite society might wish, but made into instruments of spectacle. By pounding the boards, by stamping the street stones, they carved out a living of sorts crude, precarious, yet oddly celebrated by those who paused to watch. In an age when disability was more often concealed or pitied, these dancers forced London to confront them, not through silence, but through sound and motion. The origins of such street performers stretched back before the 19th century. Even in the 18th, records speak of stump dancers, men with crude prosthetics who spun or hopped in taverns, offering entertainment for coins. But it was in the crowded Victorian city that they became a familiar part of the urban scene. London, swollen with millions, teemed with the desperate poor, many of them disabled by disease, injury, or war. Without pensions, without systematic welfare, many turned to the streets as their only stage and their only sustenance. Some sang, some begged silently with chalked boards declaring their misfortune, but others danced, and it was these that gave rise to the peculiar tradition of the wooden-legged performer. Their stages were wherever people gathered, outside gin shops, on market squares, at the edges of fairs. The dancer might balance on one leg, swinging the wooden limb as though it were part of a rhythm, or else slam both legs in alternating measure, producing a beat against the flagstones. Sometimes crude fiddlers or penny whistle players accompanied them. Sometimes they danced alone, their staccato strikes providing their own percussion. Children often laughed and clapped, delighted by the oddity. Adults, less easily charmed, might toss a coin half in pity, half in amusement. The wooden legs themselves varied greatly. Some were simple stumps of wood, rounded at the base, strapped to the thigh with belts or rags. Others were more elaborate, with crude hinges or foot-like extensions. None were comfortable, all caused pain. Yet these performers embraced them as part of their persona. A man dancing on a stump might paint it with bright colors or wrap it in ribbons, turning his infirmity into display. In this way, necessity bred performance, and performance bred a sort of precarious pride. It is important to understand the climate in which these dancers lived. Victorian London was a city brimming with anxieties about poverty, disability, and morality. To the respectable middle classes, the sight of a crippled man dancing in the street was unsettling, at once a reminder of industrial hazards, of war, of the frailty of the human body, and of the proximity of destitution. To others, however, he was simply another piece of the great urban theatre, no more unusual than a costermonger's cry or an organ grinder's tune. The wooden-leg dancers became part of London's great chorus of sounds, an accepted feature of the streetscape. However marginal their lives remained, the police, as ever, played an ambivalent role. Street performance of any kind was subject to regulation. Dancers on wooden legs were sometimes tolerated, sometimes fined for obstruction, sometimes moved along like vagabonds. Yet it was difficult to suppress them entirely. They were too mobile, too scattered, and too intertwined with the life of the streets. A sergeant might disperse one performer from Cheapside, only to hear his thumping again in Shoreditch an hour later. Like so many of the poor, they slipped through the cracks, visible and invisible at once. Stories about them occasionally appeared in newspapers, half in jest, half in scandal. One report in the 1840s spoke of a stump dancer in Holborn who, by sheer vigor, cracked the paving stone beneath him. though the tale may well have been exaggerated for comic effect. Another article derided the indecorous cavorting of disabled men outside taverns, suggesting that such spectacles degraded public morals. And yet, tucked in the corners of the press, there were also stories of admiration of a veteran who danced jigs with astonishing skill, or of a woman who, balancing on a pair of crudely fashioned wooden limbs, spun like a top to the delight of children. What is striking is the ambivalence with which society regarded them. They were mocked, pitied, admired, and condemned, often all at once. They troubled the Victorian conscience because they refused to be quiet sufferers. Instead, they made their affliction into noise, into rhythm, into a spectacle one could not ignore. In this way, they challenged the boundaries between disability and performance, between poverty and art. Some of these dancers banded together, forming loose partnerships with fiddlers, singers, or fellow cripples. One might dance while another passed the hat. In the evenings, outside the glow of the gas lamps, they sometimes gathered in groups, swapping tips and stories, their wooden legs leaning against the walls like so many discarded canes. Within these ragged fraternities, there was a rough camaraderie. Born of shared struggle, they laughed at their own misfortune with a kind of black humor, for what else could they do? To passers-by, their dance may have seemed grotesque or comical, but for the dancers themselves, it was survival. Each strike of the wooden leg on stone was both a plea and a declaration. I am here, I endure, I live still, and for a moment, in the crowded streets of the greatest city of the age, they were seen and heard, and if only briefly paid. If the first impression of the wooden leg dancers was one of oddity-thumping figures spinning in the street, their stumps drumming cobblestones, the reality of their lives was more complicated, shaped by craft, endurance, and fragile networks of survival. Their world, though seldom recorded, was bound together by the tools they fashioned, the hardships they endured, and the ways society chose to speak of them often, without ever listening to their own voices to begin with. There were the wooden legs themselves. Crude prosthetics could sometimes be obtained from hospitals or charitable institutions, but these were few and expensive. More often, the poor crafted their own or paid a neighborhood carpenter for a rough approximation. A plank of seasoned oak or ash might be cut to size, rounded at the base to make a peg, and strapped with leather thongs or even cast-off belts to the thigh. For those with a little more coin, the end might be shod with iron, producing a ringing, metallic strike upon stone that carried farther than bare wood. Some went further still, decorating their prosthetics with paint, cloth strips, or ribbons, not mere vanity, but an acknowledgement that their very survival depended on drawing the eye, catching the ear. The wooden leg was not just a support. It was an instrument, a drum, a badge, a stage property. The dancers adapted their movements to what their limbs allowed. A man with one good leg might hop in time to a fiddler's jig, his peg leg punctuating each beat. Another, with both legs amputated below the knee, might swing from side to side upon short stumps, striking them in alternating rhythm like a percussionist. The skill was not easily won. Balance had to be relearned, pain endured, exhaustion mastered. Yet many became astonishingly agile, turning their impairments into unique styles of movement that no two performers quite shared. What appeared to onlookers as antics was, in truth, a carefully honed craft born of necessity. Hardship was their constant companion. Wooden limbs rubbed raw against flesh. Infections were frequent, and pain relief scarce. The daily struggle to find a pitch free from police interference, to gather enough coins for bread and lodging, was unending. Wet weather made the wooden legs slippery and treacherous. In winter, the cold bit into joints and old wounds. Yet, despite this, many persisted year after year, because there was little else open to them. A cripple without family support might starve if he did not turn his infirmity into spectacle. Dancing awkward, painful, even humiliating was sometimes the only trade left. Within this grim reality, a kind of fellowship grew. Street performers of all sorts, ballad singers, fiddlers, blind beggars recognized one another as kin, and crippled dancers were part of this fraternity. At night, in cheap lodging houses or taverns that tolerated their presence, they shared drink and stories. One man might boast of the farthing he coaxed from a wealthy lady with a comic tumble. Another might describe the best markets for generous crowds among themselves. They gave one another nicknames: Peg, Stumpy, Iron Legs, half in jest, half in solidarity. Though life kept them on the margins, they forged bonds that made the hardship a little more bearable. Occasionally, they formed partnerships. A fiddler might accompany a dancer, splitting the coins gathered. Two amputees might perform together, making a spectacle of their synchronized stamping. There are scattered references in memoirs of the period to cripple bands, loose associations, of disabled performers who traveled fairs and markets together. Whether formal or not, these partnerships illustrate how necessity drove creativity, and how even in poverty, a sense of camaraderie could persist. Yet their visibility also drew the attention of reformers. Victorian society was preoccupied with the problem of begging and the spectacle of the poor in public spaces. To some philanthropists, the sight of crippled dancers was evidence of moral decay, that suffering was being turned into frivolity, and the public's compassion manipulated. To others, it was intolerable that disabled men should be forced to humiliate themselves for coins when institutions might shelter them. Pamphlets of the 1840s and 1850s argued for stricter regulation of street performance, with stump dancers often singled out as indecorous. Police ordinances were passed in some boroughs, allowing constables to disperse such gatherings as nuisances. And yet, the reformers never quite succeeded in erasing them. The people of London, even as they moralized, had an appetite for the eccentric, the grotesque, the comic. A wooden-legged man jigging outside a gin palace drew laughter, and laughter drew pennies. Respectability might frown, but the crowd rewarded. Thus the dancers slipped between censure and tolerance, sustained by that peculiar contradiction of Victorian life, a society that professed to pity the poor while secretly relishing their spectacled dare. Were occasional attempts to rescue the crippled entertainers. Charities sometimes offered them places in workhouses or homes for the disabled. But to accept such shelter was often to give up freedom entirely. The workhouse promised bread and lodging, but also regimentation, silence, and stigma. For many, the streets, with all their dangers, offered a rougher but more autonomous existence. Better to dance painfully for pennies and retain one's liberty, than to be hidden away behind institutional walls. Some voices, however, spoke more sympathetically. A few writers, moved by what they saw, described the wooden-legged performers as examples of courage and resilience. A magazine article from the 1860s recounted the story of a veteran of Waterloo who, having lost a limb in battle, earned his bread for decades by jigging in Covent Garden. The tone was admiring, portraying him not as a nuisance, but as a living reminder of endurance. Such accounts were rare, but they hint that even within Victorian prejudice, glimmers of respect could be found. It is difficult, from this distance, to reconstruct their inner lives. Most left no words behind. Yet if we pause to imagine cold evenings, stamping rhythm on stone, the soreness in the stump, the hope that one more passerby might toss a coin, we catch some sense of their endurance. Theirs was not a romantic life. It was brutal, marginal, often humiliating. But within it lay resourcefulness, craft, and a stubborn insistence on visibility. Each wooden limb, each uneven dance step, was both survival and statement. They turned what should have been silence, the quiet suffering of the disabled perinter noise, into rhythm, into presence. In this way, their craft was more than entertainment, it was testimony. However society judged them, the dancers on wooden legs declared themselves alive and demanded to be seen. By the latter decades of the 19th century, the figure of the crippled dancer, once familiar at market corners and gin palace doors, was fading. His decline was not abrupt, nor the result of any single event, but rather a convergence of changes, the tightening of charitable networks, the expansion of new amusements, and a gradual shift in the way society regarded both disability and street performance. Like a candle burned down to its wick, the wooden-legged entertainer dwindled until his presence on the pavement was no more than a faint ember in memory. One of the chief forces in this transformation was the rise of organized charity. From mid-century onward, philanthropic societies increasingly turned their gaze toward the disabled poor. The Victorian age, anxious about disorder in its streets, created institutions to gather up those who had once made their living in public view. Homes for veterans, asylums for the crippled, convalescent hospitals, and benevolent associations for decayed tradesmen all multiplied. These institutions promised relief from hunger and cold, yet they also demanded withdrawal from the streets. For the stump dancer who entered, the daily clang of coins in a cap was exchanged for the monotony of regulated meals, prescribed prayers, and beds arranged in rows. To the reforming eye, this was progress. To the dancers themselves, it was more complex. Some may have welcomed a reprieve from the exhaustion of performance. Others surely felt the bitterness of being silenced. In either case, as charitable institutions grew stronger, fewer crippled. Entertainers could be found stamping their rhythms on the stones of London simultaneously. The culture of entertainment was shifting. The music hall, with its warm gaslight, polished stages, an array of singers, comics, and dancers, drew crowds indoors. What had once been sought in the open air of laughter, coarse songs, the thrill of grotesque movement was now packaged for paying audiences behind closed doors. The music hall appropriated the spirit of the street, refined it, and excluded those who could not be made presentable. A wooden-legged beggar, unpolished and raw, had no place beneath the pristine arch. Mechanical novelty, too, played its part. Barrel organs, once companions of the street dancer, gave way to more intricate contrivances, and eventually to the phonograph. Where once music was coaxed by the turning of a handle in a public square, now it could be summoned in parlors by a machine. The need for human spectacle diminished, replaced by technological marvel. The figure of the peg-legged man, leaping painfully to a tune, seemed increasingly out of step with the new age of invention. There was also a moral shift in how disability was perceived. Early in the century, the sight of a crippled man dancing for coins might evoke pity mixed with amusement. By its end, it was often seen as indecorous. The Victorian cult of respectability demanded that suffering be hidden away, not flaunted. For laughter, charitable reformers urged that the disabled be protected from degrading exhibitions. Critics condemned the public for encouraging such scenes. What had once been tolerated as a curious spectacle came to be regarded as a scandalar reminder of social failings that polite society wished to erase. Legislation reinforced these attitudes. The Vagrancy Acts and the bylaws of local authorities increasingly restricted begging and street performance. Police constables, armed with the power to disperse or arrest, targeted those who seemed most conspicuous. A crippled dancer, unable to melt easily into the crowd, was among the most vulnerable. Some persisted defiantly, but more and more were driven off the corners where they once stamped their rhythms by the closing decades of the century. The wooden-legged entertainer had become rare. Observers noted their absence with a kind of surprise, as though they had vanished quietly in the night. Travel writers who described the bustle of London streets in the 1880s and 1890s mention organ grinders, costermongers, flower sellers, and match girls' butts, seldom the crippled dancer. A few lingered in provincial fairs or poorer districts, but they were ghosts of a vanishing tradition, and yet memory preserved them in curious ways. In the literature of the century, the figure of the wooden-legged man persisted, sometimes comic, sometimes pathetic. Dickens himself scattered such characters through his pages, and later writers borrowed the trope to suggest resilience or grotesquerie. Children's rhymes occasionally made mention of old Pegleg stamping out a dance. Even when the living dancers disappeared, their image remained lodged in cultural memory, transformed from living men into symbols. For veterans, particularly those of the Napoleonic Wars, the wooden leg became a kind of shorthand for sacrifice. Patriotic prints sometimes depicted the cheerful old soldier with his peg, recalling battles long past. These images sanitized the harsher reality of the street dancer, but they kept alive the association between the wooden leg and endurance. What the public preferred to remember was not the destitute beggar hopping painfully outside a tavern, but the jovial veteran, pipe in mouth, recounting heroic days. Thus, nostalgia softened the harder truths. By the dawn of the 20th century, the crippled entertainer had largely vanished from lived experience. Electricity illuminated the streets where once they had stamped in gaslight's glow. Music poured from gramophones instead of fiddlers. Public amusements were increasingly licensed, regulated, and enclosed. The wooden legs, once instruments of survival and spectacle, lay discarded in attics or burned for firewood. The brotherhoods of the streets dissolved into silence, yet the faint echoes endured. A child, grown old, might remember tossing a halfpenny into the cap of a dancing man and hearing the hollow thud of wood upon stone. A writer might recall, in some half-melancholy sketch, the strange sight of crippled figures whirling in the gutter, and so the tradition lingered not in the body but in memory, fragile, distorted, but not wholly erased in the end. The wooden-legged entertainers were victims of progress, morality, and invention all at once. They embodied a moment when poverty could be turned, however painfully, into performance, when disability could become both livelihood and spectacle. That moment passed, as moments do, leaving only its shadows behind. Tonight, if one imagines the old streets of London under mist and gaslight, one might still hear them faintly. The scrape of wood, the clatter of iron-tipped pegs, the ragged cheer of a crowd. They are not there, of course. They have been gone for more than a century. But in the quiet between the lamplighter's call and the organ grinder's tune, one may still summon them in memory. Men who danced not for glory, nor art, but for bread, and in their stamping left a rhythm that time itself has not wholly erased.